Welcome, everybody, and huge thanks to Mark for having me on here today. I'm Jessica Griffin. Mark gave you my introduction. I am based out of the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where I've been for almost 18 years, and I study all things trauma and relationships, and have done a number of things on the side, as you've heard about. I'm here today to talk about relationship prescriptions, but I specifically want to talk about the concept of relational health, and I think it's actually going to play into what Mark was talking about today, a number of the issues that are coming up in the dating industry, and I'm fascinated to hear about your worlds. It's a world I don't have that sort of brain, and I love seeing how things happen sort of behind the scenes, so it really is a privilege to be here today. I would be joined by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Pepper Schwartz, who many of you know, but she is in the middle of filming right now, married couples who literally met at the altar. And so after years of working together, Pepper and I decided to write this book together, which came out in February, not because we were looking to make money off of it, but honestly, because we wanted a project to do together. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how the book came to be, really just wanting to give something back to the community around the lessons that we've learned, both in our private practices and research, but also in this really unique platform of reality television. And so we identified some of the most common relationship pain points and then took what we know about relational health science, biology, attachment science, and cognitive behavioral therapy research and try to present it in a way that's palatable and meaningful for people and relatable. So what I'll do this morning for some of you, evening for others, so cool. I will the first part of my talk, I'm just going to lay the foundation about the critical importance of relational health, is this idea that people should pay more than $15 a month for relational health. And I'll talk about why that is, because I think there's a real connection there to what Mark was saying. And then I'll offer some strategies to get us there. And hopefully I will hit this around, I practiced this and I hit it around 21 minutes. So we'll see how I do. All right. So bear with me here. Strap on your seatbelts. So I want folks to think about, most of us have been to see a physician in the last year. Hopefully it was for a well visit, a checkup, but in those visits, what happens? You walk in, you jump on the scale, you get the good news, bad news, and then you sit in that Johnny on the table and they take your blood pressure and measure your oxygen. But the vast majority of physicians in those appointments miss one key area in those checkups. And that is, did they ask you about your relationships? My guess is they probably didn't, unless they happen to know your significant other or your friends. And even if they do, they're not asking about the qualities of those relationships. And today I'm going to tell you why that's important. So inevitably, we are all, and I did this for you all, just so you know, I knew there were going to be tech people here, but I learned how to move that saber-toothed tiger across the screen. So I'm very proud of myself, and I did that for you. So inevitably, we are all going to face stressors in our lives, real threats. So back to caveman days where I'm faced with that saber-toothed tiger in front of me, or now if maybe it's a loss of a family member, or I grew up in a home where there was child abuse, or all of us collectively facing this global pandemic we've been going through, or racism, social justice issues, we're all going to face different types of stressors and threats in our lives. And some stress is actually positive. Okay, so positive stress that Mark and I may have had today when we were trying to prepare for our talks and couldn't figure out how to share the screen, getting put before a big game or needing to perform, that stress response is activated, elevates your heart rate, your blood pressure goes up, there's stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that are released. And that temporary stress is actually helpful because it allows us to act, to do something and perform. Tolerable stress is a little bit more intense. It's when there's a longer duration of the body's stress response. When that stress response stays activated for a longer amount of time, it's a more serious event, typically such as a car accident, the death of a grandparent, experiences that are hard, but we get through them. And the research tells us, the science says that it is the tolerable stress is buffered by our supportive relationships. We get through it, but we get through it because of those supportive relationships around us. Toxic stress occurs when that stressor is present for an extended period of time. That saber-toothed tiger maybe is living in your house, but that stress is unrelenting and has an impact to our physiology and our overall health. And the science around this, we're looking at how that chronic, complex toxic stress impacts our physiology down to our cellular functioning and our DNA, including immune functioning, chronic illnesses, and ultimately shorter lifespans. So I'm going to connect this all in a minute. So bear with me here. I promise it's going to all come together. But I want you to imagine that you're taking a walk in the woods. It's a beautiful day. The sun's out. There's a light breeze in the air. You're able to enjoy your hike through nature. But then you come across this guy. There's a snake in the trail. Let everybody see this video for a second. But what happens when you see that snake? What's happening in your body? Your heart starts racing, your stomach might drop, you might start to shake, or your body sweats, and your body's releasing cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. That physiological response to stress, that body's alarm system, is universal to all human beings, whether you're in Massachusetts or Dubai or Zambia or Japan or Australia. When you see that snake, that stress response is activated, and those hormones are activated so that you do something. And what is it that you do? You may be familiar now with the terms fight, flight, and freeze. Bear with me. I'm going to give you a quick overview anyway, even if you're already familiar with that. And, thinking back if I were a cave woman, right, and I'm approached by that saber-toothed tiger, or I see that snake in the trail, that alarm system's activated, and there are a few responses I could have. There's this freeze response, which is our body's most primitive response. It engages the hindbrain, the brain stem, and it's the most primitive go-to response we have. And it can look like things like numbness, shutting down, withdrawal in relationships, even apathy, looking like they don't care. But here's the problem from an evolutionary perspective. It's not that effective. Unless I'm a teeny tiny mouse and the tiger doesn't see me, I'm kind of a big human. And so the tiger's probably going to see me. It doesn't work all that great from an evolutionary perspective. So your next responses are fight or flight. The fight response comes from an area of the brain, the amygdala, the adrenal medulla, and releases adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, the stress chemicals, as a way to fight off that stress or predator. And it looks like in relationships, swearing, yelling, irritability, anger outbursts, and, while fighting. The flight response also stems from the amygdala, but involves the adrenal cortex and releases cortisol. It's our brain's way to escape stressors and looks like avoidance behaviors such as not answering the phone, leaving abruptly, running away. Here's the thing with the stress response, though. It's only designed in the human body to be elevated for about 20 minutes. Because in 20 minutes, that saber-toothed tiger, I'm either going to freeze and he's going to walk by me, I'm going to fight the saber-toothed tiger and die, or I'm going to outrun a saber-toothed tiger. So it's only supposed to stay activated for about 20 minutes. Where this becomes a problem is when it stays elevated for longer than that. So let's imagine that you decide you love hiking. You want to get back to it. How many of you would actually return to the woods? Many of you wouldn't go back to the woods again. You'd engage in that avoidance behavior, that flight response. Maybe some of you might bring a weapon or pack heat. That's a phrase we use in the US for carrying a gun. Something we can do in the United States. But maybe next time you would actually go and you'd bring a friend with you. And so I want to talk about that fourth human response. And you're going to start to hear more about this as the research is coming out more and more about this. From an evolutionary perspective, this is the best response we've got. That fourth response, that friend response or affiliate response, engages the higher parts of the brain, the posterior pituitary. It releases oxytocin, which you all know is the love drug. But guess what? Oxytocin does more than just bond us with other people. It also drives what's called social salience, which helps me figure out, and it goes back to Mark's question around safety and helping women with that, helps me figure out who can help me and who do I need to avoid. Because the bottom line is we're born to connect. Connection with others is a biological need to survive. We can connect with others for safety, for love, for problem solving. And we've all witnessed in the largest social experiment of our time what the lack of connection can do for not just our mental health, but our physical health too. And you all are in these really unique positions and, having these apps and developing tools to help people find people. I think the challenge in thinking about coming to talk with you all today is that it's harder to find real meaningful connection without then moving on. I think back to Mark's point around people who jump out of relationships because they know they can. It's harder to find real meaningful connection and keep it. Are there opportunities to build okay, I've got this person, this relationship. How do I keep that? How do I take that to the next level? And so just to wrap this piece up, that stress, the hard things we're going to go through in life, only becomes toxic to our systems in the absence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships. That's the number one key to the impact of stress on the body becoming toxic. You can do all the yoga you want, eat all the kale salads you want. If your relationships are struggling, it will have a negative impact on your physiology, period. And so, what does that mean for our health? Thinking back to the checkup with your doctor doesn't mean this information mean for our health and well-being. And I think what it means is that it's relationships that are the vital sign. And I would argue that assessing the quality of one's relationships is just as important, if not more important, than a routine blood pressure screen. And all relationships matter, from friendships to family relationships. But in adulthood, our primary attachments most often shift from, when we're kids, it's typically a caregiver figure, shift to our romantic partners. And so today, the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how do you develop or restore relational health in romantic relationships. And so back to Pepper and I working together, that we over early morning coffee in our hotel rooms are sitting in hair and makeup, which sounds glamorous, but it's just really a lot of waiting and eyelashes. And or late in the evening with too much wine. And if Pepper bought the wine, it was wine you'd have to mortgage your second house to have. We talked so much about the couples we were working with together, couples we've worked with in our own research. And there was one point I said something sort of off the cuff, like, wouldn't it be great if you wouldn't have to go on a reality TV show to find love or fix your relationship? Like, wouldn't it be great if the exercises we used, because we have a short amount of time with these people, like what's going to get in their work, be effective? Wouldn't it be great if we could get those exercises to other people in a way that people could do things and focus on their own relational health, just like you take, vitamins or medication for your physical health? And so that is how this book was born. And so I'm just going to share some of I've really struggled with what to share with this group. So I'm just going to do some of the takeaways, and I'm happy to certainly share more. Email me afterwards if you'd like to. But how we divided this up is thinking about couples we've worked with. Most of the couples in general fall in either the mild or moderate relationship problems. And we divided it in mild, moderate, and severe, with relationship vitamins being for that mild group, that these are simple, effective exercises people can do to improve their quality of their relationships every day, even happy relationships that don't really have problems right now, to prevent, just like we take vitamins, to prevent more serious problems in the future. And so this could include, couples, even those who aren't struggling. By the way, we include in our work, very diverse couples from different countries, different religious backgrounds, gay, lesbian couples, really wanting to make sure that we were being inclusive in our work together. Moderate relationship problems are when problems have escalated and the marriage or long-term relationship is really in trouble if they don't do something immediately. So we address those with what we call relationship medicine, which are more intensive interventions or exercises couples can do together. And then lastly, for severe relationship problems, we spend less on this in the book because most of our work is really focused at that vitamins medicine level. But severe relationship problems call for what we call relationship CPR, which is where they're engaging with professional interventions, such as talking with a therapist about problems with addiction, addressing violent behavior, or even meeting with a divorce lawyer if that's what needs to happen. So a few themes, I'm just going to talk about some common themes that came up and a couple of exercises associated with those. And these are all, by the way, at the vitamins level. I have some quotes from people that we've worked with at the top of these that you can get a flavor. I'm not going to read those to you. I'm just going to get into the material. But we started with this concept, fear of change. We didn't start with communication or trust. Those get a lot of attention in the book. But fear of change, we found with so many people, gets in the way of successful relationship. There's no bigger or more common problem in a marriage or relationship than resisting or refusing change. And we mean that can cut across a number of different areas. But when one or both partners refuses to change, are considered change, it can cause a real crisis, even in long-term relationships. But the resistance to change isn't anyone's fault. It's biology. We're hardwired to resist change. Our brains prefer routine and to be in control. And those habits and routines we have send signals to our brain, signals of safety to our brain, and that all is right in the world. So getting outside of that comfort zone can be, uncomfortable. And in fact, there's some research that shows that uncertainty, which is inevitable if we're considering changing something about ourselves or our situation, can actually be more stressful to us than knowing that there's going to be negative consequences. So we hold on tight to those cozy habits, even if they're not helping us or our relationships. And so one of the exercises that we introduce, and I call it your problem solve strategy, borrowed from cognitive behavioral therapy, is a strategy that we can use, simple strategy that people can use in your relationship and other situations. The goal is to help people feel unstuck or less overwhelmed by a problem, to realize that there are actually things you can do, that there are small steps that you can take on your own and together. And so what it looks like is here, and I won't get, for time's sake, I won't get into like an example of it, but you state the problem clearly, describe the problem in 2 to 3 sentences, but why is it a problem for you? What feelings is it bringing up? How is it affecting my relationship or our relationship? And discuss it as a matter of fact as you can, the impact on the relationship. Outline a goal. What do you want to accomplish just in solving this problem? How do you want to feel once the problem's solved? And then the hard part is listing possible solutions, even bad ones. So brainstorming as many possible solutions as you can, including the solution do nothing. Because just by putting it on there, that's going to undo that freeze response we sometimes have under stress, right? Or that avoidance. And I'm therefore actively choosing to do nothing. Come up with a plan, picking 1 or 2 things on that list, combination maybe, and execute that plan. And then figuring out, talking together, how did that work out? Did it go okay? Did it not go okay? If it didn't go okay, that's all right. We'll go back to the list and try something else. So that's the problem solve strategy. We have worksheets and things like that help people with that concept. One of the things, so we talk in the relationship space, trust and vulnerability, right? We've got to have trust to have that connection. In order to build trust, we've got to be vulnerable with people. But it has a lot to do with your attachment system. And attachment is very much rooted in the brain. The brain has a biological mechanism that's designed to protect our closest relationships, called the attachment system. And it involves the limbic area of the brain, but the brain monitors the safety and availability of our closest attachment figures. And then it consists of emotions and behaviors that are related to that attachment system. So things like protest behaviors. So in a young child, it could be things like crying frantically when they're separated from a caregiver until they're reunited. But in adult relationships, it could be blowing up your partner's texts until you hear back from text in their phone until you hear back from them that everything is okay and that they're safe or the relationship is safe. And so one of the things that we suggest doing is knowing your attachment style. There are a number of measures and tools that can help you figure out what that is. Each of us, the research, it's about 30 years or so. I did some of this research on monkeys many years ago in the late 90s. And it's shown that we have a primary attachment style, and all of us will have a primary attachment style. For 1 out of 4 of us, it will change over time. And 50% of us have a secure attachment style, while 50% of us have an insecure style. And insecure is broken down into anxious, which is about 20% of us, avoidant, which is another 20% of us, or disorganized, which is a combination of those things. Your attachment style is influenced by your early childhood as well as adult relationships. And those attachment styles here, that secure attachment, about 50% of us are folks who feel comfortable with intimacy, or warm, loving, don't have major trust issues or issues with the commitment. Thinking about where you all are operating the spaces, I'd be curious, looking at the user's attachment styles and what that means about how much they're engaging or not engaging in apps, but that's a conversation for another day. Anxious attachment, these are folks who crave intimacy, but are constantly worried or anxious about that relationship or whether their partner wants to be with them or will leave them. Avoidant attachment style is those who minimize closeness and keep their partners often at more than arm's length or see connection as a threat to their independence. And then disorganized, you never know what you're going to get. And the research has shown us a couple of important findings. People with secure attachment styles tend to be happier, healthier, and in longer, more satisfying relationships. But your attachment style can change. And here's the good news. If you are not in if you don't have a secure attachment style as your primary attachment style, but you're partnered with someone who does have a secure attachment style, you don't bring them down. They actually can bring you up in the context of a safe and stable relationship. All right, next up here, I'm going to fly through this. Cognitive behavioral science. So it tells us that your brain is messing with you. The thoughts that we tell ourselves about our situations, including our romantic relationships, are actually have an impact on our feelings, our physiology, and our behavior, and ultimately our relationship with that other person. So we introduce a technique, a very simple technique called the cognitive triangle. Again, another cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy principle or technique that, simply put, just by changing the way I think about a situation, just like I might change out a baseball hat, I can have an impact on how I feel and what I do. And then taking it a step further, how I may have an impact on other people or how they might respond toward me. So here's what it might look like. I took this just right out of the book. The situation is a woman I worked with who was pretty anxious attachment style also. And she didn't hear from her partner for 6 hours and goes to this thought, he's cheating on me. He doesn't care about me. Even though she knew he'd had a busy work week, she's feeling angry, sad, jealous, anxious, irritable. Her behavior is to snap at him, send him a nasty text, withdraw when he comes home, give him the cold shoulder. But doing this cognitive triangle and challenging that initial thought and replacing it with another one, you know what? If I say to myself and say it until I can hold this in my mind, he's busy working hard, he'll call me later, it's going to have a different impact on how I feel. Maybe I'm indifferent about it, or I'm compassionate for how hard he might be working that day, or excited to see them at home. I might engage in approach behaviors, reaching out for connection, or do something else to take care of myself, get stuff off my own to-do list until they come back home. All right, can't talk about relationships without talking about sex. This is Pepper's particular area of expertise, but I will talk about it related to physical touch being medicine. A long hug releases oxytocin, improves our mood, lowers our blood pressure, improves our immune functioning, and being touched activates certain areas of our brain that releases dopamine, serotonin. Sexual intimacy magnifies that experience. And so when couples are struggling with their sex life, it's really a barometer for other things that may be going on. And it doesn't mean you're not going to ebb and flow. That happens, but it's really important that we work with couples to prioritize that. These are 2 strategies we suggest at the vitamins level. One is work it out to work it out, having couples exercise together, and there's a plan for what that might look like, and then having some sort of sexy time related to that. And I'm not talking about at the gym, but like later have a nice meal or something together, or meet in the shower. It's up to you guys to figure that out. And then scheduling the sex. It sounds very unsexy, but actually very effective to prioritize connection, where you have a certain time. My colleague who call it sex on Sundays. It's not all that spontaneous, but it's highly effective strategy for staying connected. Finances, the number one issue that couples fight about, and the second leading cause of divorce behind infidelity. And so the number one thing we can do is talk about it and get folks to communicate about it. The vast majority of people, 90% of people, are uncomfortable talking about money. So one of the strategies is to get financially naked. And that's where you put it all on the table. It is not easy to do. It takes some time, but you do net worth statements, assets, liabilities, you put it all out there and you have a conversation about that. And just doing that action can really take a lot of the conflict out of financial topics. Communication, as you all know, key ingredient in relationship satisfaction. What we do, John Gottman's research in communication is really hallmark research around communication relationships, but negative communication patterns, with the most negative being contempt. I'm not going to talk about all of the types, but contempt is the one that is the number one predictor of divorce in couples. And that's when there's a complete lack of respect for your partner, and that contempt is chronic. And so one of the ways we address that in managing contempt is the magic ratio of a 5-to-1 ratio, with 5 positive statements for every 1 negative statement that you may have. And household responsibilities, it's never 50-50. We work with couples to understand that there still is a massive gender inequity when it comes to household responsibilities. And so we can certainly talk through that, but it's more about fairness than it is equality. And so working with couples around that. But some of the research is really interesting in this area. And I won't get into all of it for the sake of time. But one thing I will say is do the dishes. So for households that are doing the dishes, where men in particular are doing the dishes, they're the households who have the most sex. So everybody go home and do the dishes. You'll thank me later. But for whatever reason, doing the dishes is related to greater relationship and sexual satisfaction in couples. And the last chapter, and I will stop talking, is a bonus chapter. We can't talk about relationships and marriage without talking about children and families. And the people who say that parenting, having a child, changes your life are lying to you. It doesn't change your life, it ends it. You have a new life now. And there is this shift that couples have to make, this point in their relationship or marriage where they make that shift and need to mourn the previous life they had. There's less room for spontaneity. There's less us time, but it's a time you learn the hard truth that the life you had before is over, but you've got a new life. And maybe it is beautiful in lots of other ways, but there is this mourning period that happens in ways in which you've got to still prioritize yourselves as the relationship. This idea of the kids come first actually isn't good for kids in the long run. It doesn't mean kids come last, but you don't want to send that message that your relationship takes the back seat. So very simple technique, a 7 to 30 second kiss. Your kids might be like, but it's good for children to see both conflict resolution as well as affection between parents. But that having that kiss prioritizes your relationship for the two of you. It gets you out of just mom and dad mode. And then it can lead into that alternate date night where couples take turns picking out a date, ideally at least weekly, and going away from the kids to prioritize that time for connection. And so I probably went a couple minutes over, Mark. I am sorry here for that, but please use me as a resource. Here's my contact info, and I'm happy to share any and all of that. Emails probably best, and I will stop sharing. Thank you all very much for listening to me and bearing with my saber-toothed tiger animations.
No, that was great. Thank you very much, Dr.
Sure.
Griffin. I must say, I nearly choked and fell on the floor laughing when I heard you say having children doesn't change your life, it ends it. I'm going to remember
that's
that
the next book, is the parenting one. I couldn't do it without at least a chapter, and it's just so much, because it's a thing that couples just struggle with in a way that you don't get that preparation. They don't tell you that oftentimes in all the baby books you're reading, and they don't figure it out usually till it's too late, 6 years in, and they figure it out, and sometimes it's too late.
But it ends it in a good way, I would argue, as a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 3 of my own. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong.
Life is over as you know it.
Your life is over. Well, that's the thing. And then once you figure that out, then okay, now we can do this. This is a different life. We got to figure out how we can still have the aspects of that we had before that can help us maintain that connection.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the ultimate stressor, and it just really complicates life in many ways.
Absolutely.
But it's worth it in the end. In fact, I remember seeing a study about happiness, about people who've got kids and don't. And it's very interesting seeing kind of the curve of happiness. People that don't have kids are generally less bumpy when it comes to happiness, but they're not as happy afterwards, when kids are older. Now, parents tend to bump along, and then they have kids, and they're generally less happy, and then teenagers happen, and they're even less happy. and then the kids leave the nest, and they're more happy than their single counterparts. So there is that. But we don't provide any of this educational dating apps. So one key question I'd like to ask you, as it kind of runs a thread along here, is like, what can we do? What, based on this kind of counseling, would you like to see in dating apps?
I think that next step, sort of, you've got your person, you make that connection, and let's say they hit a bump in the road. Okay, how do you help to resolve that? Is there anything built in on the back end? So I've got this person now. How do I keep them, or how do we grow this relationship in a meaningful way?
Yeah.
And rather than me getting pulled into the, okay, well, I can just swipe this way or that way. Can't remember which way it is. It's been a long time. But that idea that could we build something in on the back end to, support those relationships and to help them to grow, and take a relationship checkup, so to speak, right? Is there a way to do that?
Functionally, what would that look like?
Um,
We've got them into a relationship, paired them up. We've listened to them for a while. We've got an idea of who they are based on their behaviors. We've paired them up, and then we just say goodbye to them. What would you like to have happen instead?
well, I think, and I know there's at least one app, Paired, because I do some consultation for them, that keeps them connected, right?
Mm.
Is there a way to, explore some of these common areas that we identify in couples? I didn't get into other ones, like managing expectations. That's huge. Oftentimes this frustration we have in our relationship is our expectations were just off. It's not because that person was intentionally trying to be a jerk. Maybe they were, but a lot of times it's just my expectations about what was supposed to happen then, and then communication about those expectations. So is there a way in the and apps to check in about those things, or provide some education about
Mm.
here's some things that you could do to make this work, and not just to sort of get you down the aisle or into that long-term commitment with one another, but to keep it so that it is a healthy space that you enjoy being in a long-term way.
Yeah. People do need help. I think this generation needs more help than ever. I've always said getting the girl and keeping the girl are two separate things.
Exactly.
Need a little bit of help, especially guys, and the other way around. But
And
uh,
I think
getting the partner,
yeah,
yeah,
and there's such an opportunity you all have to do that. I think the challenge would be what you're saying. How do you get guys engaged in that sort of, I got
yeah,
the girl, well, now I got to talk about the relationship. Like, how do we do that? And why is it? And sometimes I find with men in particular that talking about the physiology, like why this is biologically helpful for you, why is this is important to your health. Research shows that you're going to live longer. You're going
mm,
to be probably more financially well off. You're going to be happier in general. And it's sort of, feeding that back. What's in it for me, and why take the time to nurture that? And I don't mean to stereotype, because I know plenty of my male friends who would be up about, talk about relationships more than I do. But in general, I find that it's harder. I hear from couples I work with that getting him to do this is a bit of a challenge. So
and what I've heard in the research is that guys are less inclined to take relationship counseling, but are more feel the hurt more later in life if they're not in a relationship. It almost seems like men really need women. This is by preponderance. This is not carte blanche, of course, but by preponderance, men need women more and don't function as well outside of a relationship, whereas women tend to function outside of relationships better than guys, and are more receptive to relationship advice. Is that a correlation? Is it partly because women are more open to relationship advice, do you think, that they are, functional outside of apparent relationships? Is there some correlation there? Is there something we can learn from that?
I think that's something we're still trying to figure out, why those differences, because there are different, and again, these are in heterosexual relationships, and some of the differences come back together when we look at gay lesbian couples. But this idea that men tend to do better long term, and women are okay later in life without men. And I mean, it depends on the research you're looking at, or what you're measuring, happiness versus how they're doing economically. There's different ways we look at quality of life. But I think that women are, just from biological perspective, hardwired for the nurture, to be in that nurturing space, which lends itself more to talking about relationships and doing that work. And so, I find, again, talking about the physiology, what's in it for me, that sometimes has been my backdoor, and not calling it therapy, calling it like coaching, or
Mhm.
training is another way
Yeah.
of doing it. Training. I did a lot of work with military guys, and we talk about it. It's relationship training. This is training, but
Yeah.
that fits in. So I think it's also in the delivery and the language we're using.
I have some questions for you from our esteemed audience. I've got Brad Jones, who's got an upvoted question here. I run a startup platform. So Brad Jones runs Meet Kingsters, by the way. I run a startup platform that seeks to destigmatize/normalize the pursuit of shared sexual preferences in addition to traditional relationship compatibility. Do you have any thoughts on sexual compatibility in relationship satisfaction?
Yes, I do. It is a key ingredient in relationship satisfaction that you're sexually compatible in some way, and or that you are able to. It comes back to communication. I'm sure, Brad, in your world how important communication is in talking about sexual preferences, including sort of non-traditional relationships, things like that. And so being able to talk about it, put it on the table, doesn't mean you have to be 100% on the same page, but the closer in compatibility and interests, they tend to be less conflict, and it's the conflict that results in the relationship satisfaction or not. And the conflict is there if the communication isn't happening. So are there opportunities to build in to these apps direct communication about that? And even, would you feel comfortable telling me you're not comfortable? Asking those sorts of questions. I think about safety. When you talk about safety, Mark, it's not just physical safety, but psychological safety for people. And that, having a space to communicate that in a way that feels, judgment free and sets it up that this is just an important part of, conversations folks should be having in relationships, I think is the key to that.
Thank you. I've got one more question for you from Sergey Sigitov from Unison. He asked, do you know internet services or apps that use this information about relationships? You mentioned Paired.
Yeah, so Paired is, I don't know if they're part of this group, Mark, but they are UK based, just a few years old, but the idea is to bring folks together and keep them connected. So this is when you're in a relationship, it's with a partner. So you plug in a lot of different information, and they have games in the app. There are questions that it has for each couple to complete. They're just starting this thing called Paired Journeys, which is what I'm going to be helping them with. On the one I'm doing is on parenting in particular. But so that's one that I'm aware of, but I'm not aware of others. But it's also, I just may not be familiar with them. There may be many others that exist. I just don't know that. So thank you, Mark, for having me.